Even if there is no many audience in this room, we'll start our session right now. It is a great honor for me to moderate this session, multilateralization of the Korean Peninsula process, an initiative for revitalization of Jeju peace process. This session is jointly organized by the Korean Society of Contemporary European Studies and Jeju Peace Institute. Since the Pyongyang Olympic Games last year, the Korean Peninsula has witnessed unprecedented opportunities and challenges for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Even though the nuclear deal between North Korea and the United States has fluctuated, we still believe that there is a hope for striking the deal in a certain moment, and consequently, the Korean peace process will move toward multilateralization for regional peace and prosperity in Northeast Asia. With regard to this, I believe that the Helsinki process can be a model for the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia. The Helsinki process, particularly the Helsinki Final Act, which was adopted by 35 European countries, including the United States and Canada in 1975, had significantly contributed to the end of the Cold War in Europe. And in 1989, and laid a cornerstone for building a pan-European security community in Europe. I think that it is high time to revisit the Helsinki process to draw upon lessons for the Korean peace process and Northeast Asia. For this, I invited Ambassador John Maresca to this session. Ambassador Maresca was Deputy Head of the U.S. delegation for the negotiation of the Helsinki Final Act and served as Ambassador and Chairman of the United States delegation to the OSCE in 1989. Indeed, he was a principal architect of the agreement which formally ended the Cold War and established new institutions for the post-Cold War era. I believe that he is a working history of Europe. So I'm very privileged to introduce Ambassador John Maresca to the session. We will listen to his keynote speech about 20 to 30 minutes. Following his keynote speech, we have now three discussants. So three discussants will present his comments on his speech. May I call on Ambassador John Maresca?
Thank you very much. I hope I can live up to your advertisement. I'm going to speak much off the cuff here because these events were a long time ago. I've thought about them over many years. I've written about them. And I've also thought a lot about how they might apply in this part of the world. Because I have been coming here to Korea for various reasons for some years. And each time I come here, of course, one is faced with the problem with the North. And as someone who has worked in similar situations, I have always been fascinated by the notion that somehow the same ideas, the same practices, the same approaches that we used in the CSCE might apply here. And I'm also surprised, repeatedly surprised, at the hauntingly similar circumstances that we faced when dealing with the situation in Europe half a century ago. I hate to say that, but that's what it was, half a century ago. and the situation that has been faced here in Korea for so long. And so I have that in the back of my mind as I go through this. The Helsinki negotiations started well before they were announced, because in NATO we were preparing for them for years. We were hoping that there would be some kind of a break in the relationship with the Soviet Union, and we were preparing for that. At a certain point, we even nominated a negotiator, and as it happened, it was Manlio Brosio. He was the Italian who had been Secretary General of NATO and had just completed his tour of duty in that. I had been his chef de cabinet, so immediately when he retired from that position, he was asked by the Allies to be their explorer. That was the term that was used in exploring with the Soviet Union how we could have a negotiation. And he asked me to help him on this. So the two of us had a designated mission, which never happened, because a few months later, the Soviets in Moscow issued a communique, which was a very long, typically Soviet communique, and buried deep in the paragraphing, there was a statement that the Soviet Union would not negotiate with the representative of a military alliance. At which point Brosio read that and said, well, that's the end of my mission, and he retired, went home to Italy. That was the first attempt of the NATO alliance to engage in negotiations to end the Cold War, and it was unsuccessful. But we staggered on, and eventually the Soviets got in touch with the Finns, and the Finns organized a big tea party. That's what they called it. It was like an invitation to tea. And they invited all of the missions in Helsinki to come, and everyone came. And literally tea was served, and we chatted and so forth on a friendly basis. It's all very friendly. And then we all sat down. And that began a one-year process of exploring possibilities for negotiations. The Soviets, of course, were there, but they were just one of many, many other countries. And right away, I saw the great advantages of that multilateral setting for us, for them, for everyone. Because the main issues, which were, of course, U.S.-Soviet issues and issues relating to military levels and that sort of thing, those were the serious issues. They were all obscured by the politesse of the thing. Everybody was being very kind to each other. We were sipping tea. So everything was sort of papered over and became polite. Polite is a really good beginning for serious discussions. And so getting to be polite was a big step forward in that Cold War era. I remind you that this was really the middle of the Cold War, very, very bad relationship between the Soviet Union and the West. Well, all of that doesn't relate to you here except in one very specific way. And that is that, of course, in the midst of this negotiation, which took shape in that way, in the midst of that negotiation was the divided state of Germany, left over from the Second World War, with East Germany occupied by lots of Soviet armed forces, including like, maybe 1,000 heavy tanks and things like that. So that was a very serious issue at the center of this negotiating process, which of course was surrounded by all kinds of other things, exchanges of people and stuff like that. But at the heart of it was that. And so at the heart of the whole negotiation was Germany. And skipping ahead a couple of decades, what was facilitated by this negotiation was the reunification of the two Germanys. And that's what has haunted me as I've come to Korea over the years. This similarity between the problem that we faced at the beginning of the CSCE negotiations and the problem which you still have here in terms of a country divided. Now, in many ways, of course, the situation is much more serious here. Time has moved ahead. There are nuclear weapons and so forth and so on. But at the heart of it is still the relationship between the two parts of this state, which has been separated for so long, just as it was with the two Germanys. So that aspect of the situation has been in my mind for some time as I've come here. We, of course, we never addressed this issue directly in our negotiations with the Soviet Union. The question of Germany was never spoken of. But at a certain point, after a couple of years of negotiation had gone by, the Germans came privately to the senior level of the U.S. government, namely Henry Kissinger, and said, we need to reserve the possibility of reunification. We can't sign a result of this negotiation which does not reserve that possibility. They were very careful to explain that they never expected reunification to happen. That was very clear. Nobody expected the two Germanys to reunite. That separation was viewed as permanent. And there were two Germanys at the negotiating table, I remind you. They were sat right next to each other. They wanted to sit next to each other at the negotiating table. And by the way, Austria did not want to sit next to them, and so they asked the United States to sit in between at the negotiating table. So by an odd twisting of the alphabet using the French alphabetical order, the United States was seated in between the two Germanys on one side and Austria on the other side. Figure that out alphabetically if you can. But anyway, that the reunification of Germany was not considered on the table. But the Germans, the West Germans, needed to have something that, at least in principle, preserved the possibility of reunification. And so Henry Kissinger engaged in a very private, very secret, let's say, negotiation with the Soviet Union, out of which came a phrase. And that phrase was tabled anonymously one day in the CSE. It just appeared on a piece of paper like that, just the phrase, all around the negotiating table. And the Canadian representative said, I would like to congratulate the negotiators, whoever they may be. And that was included in the final act. And that was a way of preserving the possibility of the reunification of the two Germanys. Only later did that phrase come into its own. And it came into its own largely because of popular demand in Germany. Over a period of many years following the signature of the final act, during which there was an increase in exchanges and contacts and interest in some kind of opening in East Germany, because the situation, the difference between the two Germanys had become so dramatic. People becoming wealthy, driving around in Mercedes cars on one side of the frontier, and starving, literally starving to death in some cases, in East Germany. And so it became so dramatic that there became a swelling of interest in reunification, which you remember the scenes of people climbing up on the wall, hammering at it with sledgehammers and so forth and so which led to the reunification, permitted by that phrase in the Helsinki Final Act. So all of this is in the back of my mind because I lived through it. And when I come here to Korea, I look at the situation and I say, there's something that needs to be tried here. There are possibilities, perhaps. Of course, it's a different culture. And there are now nuclear weapons, but people are people. And relationships between people of the same ethnicity, of nationality, who speak the same language, those relationships don't change, ever. And so I think there are some lessons to be learned from Helsinki. What they are, I suppose we'll discuss. These are the things I wanted to say kind of to open the discussion. It tells you where I'm coming from in this discussion. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Maraska briefly summarized the early stage of the Helsinki process. He mentioned that there is a similarity between Korea and Northeast Asia and Europe at that time. I think we have to have more detailed discussions on this. What is the similarities? From my point of view, there are two similarities, at least two similarities. That is the international climate. At the time when the Helsinki process started, it was the détente. So the multilateral negotiation started in the year of 1972, which was the peak of détente. But now in Northeast Asia, probably very similar international climate since last year, because we had, Inter-Korea Summit meeting and 2 times summit meeting between United States and North Korea, so that it lessened the tensions drastically, so that it can be comparable to the international climate at the time in Europe. And the other similarity might be that the German question, multilateral negotiation for CSC was possible because of the German issue. The German issue was settled down. At the time, in 1972, quadripartite agreement on Berlin was achieved. And then also there was agreement between the Germany and Poland and Czechoslovakia about the territorial issues. Meanwhile, in North Asia, we have a German question, which is very similar to a Korean question. But since the last year, Korean question start to change. So that in that regard, I think there is at least two similarities. And then Ambassador also mentioned particularly the German issue, which is related to the key, which was a key security issue in Europe. But I think we need to discuss in more details about this issue later on. Now I would like to invite Professor Landon Hancock from Kent State University. He is an expert on peace building and conflict resolution. Probably he will discuss the ongoing issue on the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia from the perspective of peace building. Please.
Thank you. I want to preface this with the caveat that I am not an expert on Northeast Asia or the Korean situation, but just drawing a little bit on some of the things I've been hearing and some of what Ambassador Maraska has talked about. One of the things, if we think about the peace and the peace process, one of his colleagues, maybe you knew Hal Saunders, was the man who coined the term peace process. So in addition, Robert Gallucci, who spoke yesterday about the North Korean situation, discussed one of the drawbacks that we'd had to the failed Hanoi summit, which was The fact that the President of the United States has gotten personally involved means it's very difficult to hand it back down to lower level people, because the North Koreans can reasonably expect to want to meet with the President, and we have seen them say they don't want to meet with Mike Pompeo, they don't trust John Bolton. So that creates a difficulty that maybe going back to a multilateral level might allow it to reduce down to lower levels. I wanted to point out a couple of things that, that Ambassador Maresca brought up that I think are really important from a conflict resolution perspective. This is the idea of focusing on process. This is what we do in conflict resolution. And the thought that you don't just jump into a negotiation, you don't just grab for the brass ring, but you think about it in a longer-term process. His revealing that you had a long pre-negotiation of deciding how and when you were going to negotiate, what you were going to negotiate, who you were going to have at the table, is something that's quite key in terms of creating a sustainable peace process. Because a peace process doesn't end with the agreement. It actually kind of begins with the agreement. We've seen a number of agreements between North Korea and its neighbors in the United States over the past 20 to 25 years, and they've always seemed to stumble on the implementation. So the peace process begins with a careful analysis of all the different parties, their goals, and we have to think about those goals very broadly in terms of, you know, who are the players and movers and shakers within each country. So you have in the United States, you have President Trump, who wants to have an agreement. You have his national security advisor, who's been on record saying that he doesn't want an agreement. So you have different poles of power in the United States. I assume the same is true here in the Republic of Korea, where you may have those who really want to reapproach North Korea and those who are much more cautious. And so you have to think about what room does each group have to negotiate. The same must be true in North Korea, although certainly it's opaque to me. And I'm getting the sense from listening to some folks who are experts on North Korea that it's fairly opaque to many of them as well. This is unfortunate. I went to several panels discussing North Korea, and people talked about what they could perceive from the outside, but it's difficult to know who the movers and shakers are. One example they gave that seemed to illuminate was one of the last agreements that was reached was scuttled when the United States Department of Justice went ahead and put sanctions on a bank that was doing business with North Korea just as an agreement was about to be signed. That tells me that there are power players in North Korea who are benefiting from the ability to get those funds. And it also says that there's very poor coordination in the U.S. or that the U.S. didn't really want the agreement. So all of these things have to come together, and you have to be aware of all of them as you're beginning to make these negotiations. So I think another element that you brought up that was really important was the idea of the Tea Party. This idea of the Tea Party allows the main parties, in this case maybe the DPRK in the United States, to fade a little bit into the background and handle the main problems within a larger multilateral mechanism. It allows for the politeness. It allows for exchanges to take place that maybe aren't as productive as you might like to have them be. So in the Hanoi summit, you sit down, you say, we want this, they say no, you get up and you leave, and the summit's over. And that's very dramatic, and it's very bad in a dramatic way. I think, you know, we can talk more about elements of conflict resolution, elements of the CSCE process. Certainly our colleagues will have more to add, but I will want to just throw one question out for the ambassador, which is, can you please tell us what the phrase was? Thank you. Yes, you mentioned the phrase that helped the reunification of Germany, but you didn't actually tell us what the phrase was. So I think we'd all be interested to know that.
Frontiers can be changed in accordance with international law by peaceful means and by agreement.
I think Professor Hancock will give us more deep insight how to deal with conflict or nuclear issues on the Korean Peninsula later on. Now, I'd like to ask Professor Kim from Hanguk University of Foreign Language to present what's going on, what has been done to deal with issues of the Korean Peninsula.
Thank you, Chairman. Very happy to meet Ambassador Mariska again after a long time. I do remember when my university opened UPS program at our Graduate School for International Area Studies. He kindly visited our campus, and we started this program when he was president of that University for Peace in San Jose, Costa Rica. Yeah. It was about 10 years ago already. We're still learning this program at our graduate school. Yeah. The topic I have to present today is that how to revitalize Jeju peace process. Really hard issue to tackle with. And I'm not really an expert on that area. Rather, I am a kind of tribute of area studies, in particular European studies in Korea. Therefore, my argumentation quite be limited on that aspect. How the Korean scholar studying Europe and EU can contribute on this matter, which is quite turbulent and troublesome, even though the last year there was a mood of dialogue and peace process, but certainly stalled in Hanoi. And therefore, how to overcome this situation is really an issue to all of us. Idealistically, we always imagine a kind of East Asia community building. Then we are very happy. We among Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans really cooperate each other. Because in reality, we do that in terms of economic interrelations. Our trade volume is ever growing, interdependent among each other. And therefore, we created even a kind of unilateral institution. And that secretariat is located in Seoul. That is Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat among China, Korea, and Japan. At that time, we imagined that Seoul could be a kind of Brussels in East Asia to start our unilateral endeavor, and eventually we may create a kind of European Union-like community here in East Asia. Therefore, idealistically, that kind of dream is really happy to dream of. But in reality, unfortunately, between Korea and China, the bilateral relation is not so good because of so-called SAD system deployed in South Korea. Therefore, our relations went quite bad. Between Korea and Japan, really bad. I think that will be more worse from now in the years to come. No? That is the most expert examined in that way. Therefore, how to overcome this stalled and stagnant situation to make better in this area is a really hard issue for me. To tackle with this issue, I may reflect briefly how Korean administration so far really tried to make better this issue, in particular way, peace in the Korean Peninsula. From my memory, I think it was former President Kim Dae-jung started after the financial crisis back in 1997. We Asians expected a lot from Europe and United States, but unfortunately, those help didn't arrive. Therefore, we Asians should create our own help. Therefore, we created a kind of so-called Chiang Mai initiative, multilateral swap system to solve this issue. And also Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir argued that a kind of Asian value we have to develop. Therefore, in that area, and also we created a kind of ASEAN plus 3 system, which means ASEAN countries together with China, Korea, and Japan. And in that area, President Kim was very eager to develop that issue. And also he even got Nobel Peace Prize, contributing dialogue between Seoul and Pyongyang. I do still remember these good times. And after that, the successive government, Roh Moo-hyun, also argued that a kind of Northeast Asia community building. But at that time, he adopted a kind of balance concept, which to many experts, a little bit beyond our capacity. Balancing Korea toward the big neighbors are really quite an easy task indeed. Therefore, that attempt is not really fully materialized. And then successive government went to more center-right, the conservative regime, because Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun was much more liberal and progressive. Therefore, they adopted so-called sunshine policy, more providing help to North Korea to open more talks. But back to conservative regime, such as Lee Myung-bak, he also declared a kind of Asian strategy, but his idea was much limited to trade issues. At the time when the WTO and Doha agenda was practically stopped. Therefore, rather than multilateral intention, more bilateral chances are more evident. Therefore, we started with so-called KORUS, which means Korea-US FTA negotiation, and together with Korea-EU FTA. And after 2 or 3 years, by 2009, we really concluded those negotiations, and finally, those FTAs are now in practice. And next administration is Park Geun-hye, started from 2013. And Park Geun-hye also declared a kind of Seoul process, modeled after Helsinki process. She also studied. And her idea was basically 3 steps. First of all, peace in Korean Peninsula. Second step is Northeast Asia Peace Initiative, we call NAPC. And third one is Eurasian Initiative, which means intercontinentally we cooperate. In terms of NAPC already, in that regard, between KND now, then IFANS, and together with EU ISS in Paris, the EU Institution of Security Studies, they had diverse dialogues, how to develop more this idea further. But more provocative actions, and together with impeachment of herself, her idea was practically stopped. And finally, as of now, we have our current administration, who is Moon Jae-in. Very happily, President Moon adopted a kind of, rather than totally stop with the past, in a certain sense, he continued and upgraded Park Geun-hye's foreign policy. And he adopted a kind of NAPCR, which means Northeast Asia plus community of responsibility. Here, he emphasized, because in a NAPC period, much more soft security issues are dealt, while in NAPCR, this administration also adopted more hard security issues together. And in terms of cooperating partners, rather than Northeast Asia, current administration included 2 directions. One is new northern policy, the other is new southern policy. Therefore, I think this southern policy orientation is quite new compared to former administration. Therefore, in terms of theory, I think quite better than former forms. And Luckily, last year started this inter-Korean dialogue, even to North Korea, U.S. summit meeting, etc., etc. Therefore, in a certain sense, I think the atmosphere is quite better, except that Hanoi summit meeting. So after said this, then what kind of contribution might Europe or European Union can contribute on this issue? Well, from my fellow scholars in Europe, some of them are writing on this issue, such as Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Korea chair in VUB, also Teresa Novotná in Berlin. They frequently dealing with the issues. Then recently, they are arguing that EU can contribute more, but problem is that upon invitation either by North Korea or US or even by South Korea, without invitation, very difficult to engage the European Union. But according to me, throughout diverse international arrangement, even though Iran case and North Korea is quite different, but I had an occasion to study the Iran deal, and I have found that European Union did a great contribution to make possible that final deal. No? And they say that the European Union was coined after this deal so many expressions such as honest broker, neutral actors, mediator, trustworthy guardian, conciliator, compliance checker, even using Latin, primus inter pares, which means first among equals. Equals, but really initiated dialogue. So, with this concept, I think if upon invitation, EU can contribute many things. I may take some examples, such as why not open separate EU delegation in Pyongyang? Currently, EU ambassador in South Korea also deal with those regime, but separate EU delegation might help better relations in the months to come. No? That is one aspect. And also, EU has a separate sanction toward North Korea. Therefore, make ease of these sanctions. And why not, such as academic exchanges with North Korea and European universities, and many others. Therefore, to begin with, utilizing this European negotiation skill, and also once some talk are really begun, European expert, they have a good expert in this examining nuclear program. They can contribute on that issue also. Therefore, in diverse perspectives, and also the very history of integration of Europe is a kind of successive negotiation among member states. No? Even still now, after European parliamentary election, they have to decide who to be president of European Parliament, European Commission, European Council, and High Representative, etc. Therefore, they every day discuss on this issue throughout negotiation process. No? Therefore, that kind of experience might help, again, upon invitation. EU cannot independently engage in Korean Peninsula. That is too much. But upon invitation, can EU significantly contribute to the peace process in Korean Peninsula? And that's my understanding.
Thank you, Professor Kim. So you heard he briefly summarized the former government's effort to multilateralize peace process on the Korean Peninsula, starting from Kim Dae-jung administration, Nomu현 administration, and Park Geun-hye administration. In fact, what is called a Jeju process was pursued by the Nomu현 government at the time, modeling from Helsinki process, but it wasn't quite successful. And then after President Park Geun-hye took office, she started what is called a Seoul process. But at the beginning of her administration, he used the term Seoul process, but later on, she used the term Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative instead of a peace process, because peace process has the term peace process has a negative connotation, because that means the peace process, the Seoul process. If we use the term Seoul process, that means that South Korea take a lead. It might, cause negative response from the main power like China or the United States. And then Professor Kim also mentioned about the role of UN in the Korean peace process. Probably we need more discussions on this after later on. Now I'd like to invite Professor Lee Jae-sung from Korea University. Probably we will discuss about how you can approach the Korean peace process bilaterally or multilaterally.
Thank you, Chairman. And this is my great pleasure to attend this great panel. And once again, I appreciate the very valuable comments and speech from Professor Mariska. Well, Helsinki process is, well, especially in this part of the world, the other side of the Eurasian continent has been regarded and has been discussed as a reference model of regional cooperation. But at the same time, oftentimes it was regarded as a myth. So both optimism and pessimism coexisted here in this part of the world for a long time. The optimist would say eventually Korea, the Korean Peninsula and the China, Russia, US, Japan will join in a kind of multilateral setting, multilateral dialogue. So somebody suggested, well, Northeast Asian NATO, for example, or we can build Northeast Asian community. Why not? So but those ideas have been regarded as too much idealistic, especially with a very strong flavor, with very strong scent of realism and Cold War competition in Northeast Asia. On the other side, the pessimist used to say, well, this is a great idea, but Helsinki is Helsinki, Europe is Europe, and Northeast Asia is different. Okay, so well, which one will be right? We have to see. But well, at least one thing is clear: the necessity of this kind of multilateral and regional discussion and regional cooperation is getting ever more important, because the Cold War competition is basically a zero-sum game. Okay, and still Northeast Asian countries are living in and heading toward another round of new Cold War, and the U.S.-China competition is growing. China, Japan is competing, and inter-Korean relations is in the middle, and as Professor Kim mentioned, Korea-Japan relation has been in an ice age for a while. Okay, so this is a very tough situation to talk about multilateralism, but at the same time, we can say that because we are in a very tough period, so we need to talk about some possible the solution to get out of this zero-sum game and building a few blocks for the positive-sum game in this part of the world. I guess that will be the overall setting to address the Helsinki process and multilateralism in this part of the world. And I will start with a quick two questions to Ambassador Maresca. My first question is, what has been the role of the United States in the Helsinki process? When I read the Helsinki Finer Act, I actually feel a couple of different tastes. Okay, well, there are several different clauses. Okay, some clauses read like the kind of the French or German wine. Some specific clause taste like the Russian vodka, Soviet vodka, I would say. And some sentences read like the American bourbon whiskey. So I personally interpret Helsinki process and Helsinki Finer Act as some sort of melange from the both sides, the eastern side and the western side, and that somehow made a very unique balance. So in the middle, and I'm curious, what is the role of the United States, and well, this is a rare chance to meet the real guru in the Helsinki process. So I may ask the question: what has been the single biggest enabling factor for the success for the Finer Act, Helsinki Finer Act, and what has been the single biggest obstacle that hindered and they gave pain to this process? So I will leave these two questions to the ambassador, and I may just briefly add a few more the perspective, my point on the multilateral cooperation in Northeast Asia and also the Korean Peninsula. Well, we are talking about multilateralism, but to talk about multilateralism, we have to address the issue of bilateral relations. And oftentimes, especially among the academicians, the bilateralism and multilateralism are kind of contradicting or the concept from the two different poles. But I believe that the peace-building process requires both bilateral and multilateral. Okay, multilateral relation alone does not guarantee peace. Well, we have to get out of the dichotomy of good and evil. A lot of people think multilateralism is more useful, more efficient, something good. Bilateral is more unilateral. But my approach my perception is bilateralism, bilateral solution is just more efficient in solving a specific problem, in finding a right answer. Multilateralism is more useful as a management system. We can lock in the process in the long run. So based on the time horizon in the short run solution, well, we have to bring more to the bilateral element in reality. And for a longer term peace building process, then multilateralism will be very useful. So we can give different value and different role for the bilateral and multilateral system. In Northeast Asia, we had multilateral setting. It's called the six-party talk. Okay, six-party talk was an ideal format considering the key stakeholder. All the major key stakeholders were in the system, and it ran a couple years. But in reality, it did not serve the main objective of non-proliferation and the prevention of North Korean nuclear program. So there was a series of dialogue, but they did not reach an effective agreement, and especially the compliance system. So but at least a lesson might have been learned. And my one lesson from the six-party talk experience was that a formality A formality is important, but not everything. And even a small but solid outcome is preferable. So something we do need a substance. Okay, so well, as a scholar, well, like the Professor Kim Si-hong, as a scholar in European integration, I myself try to find the element of integration, and especially not just European, but what could be the universal, general and universal elements of regional cooperation. And especially I look at the period of creating ECSC from 1945 to 1951. Precedent the event reaching to the European coal and steel community, and I may share a few findings as my concluding point, and I will use the term trap, the analogy of trap. Well, actually, I would suggest a few traps to be avoided in Northeast Asia to reach the successful cooperation. So the first trap would be the trap of founding father. Okay? When one country or one leader wants to be a single parent, then it may not work. That means holding a flag is important, but multiple leaders are sharing the flag, then highly likely we may reach to a goal more efficiently. So not just one founding father, but founding fathers, multiple leadership would be truly important. The second trap is the trap of formality. And here formality, I mean institution building. We are trying to make Northeast Asian version of Helsinki process. Okay, for that we may build Northeast Asian security dialogue, blah, blah, blah. We can name a few. Formality, institution building, very important, but a big rhetoric with a formality will guarantee, in my opinion, will be a guaranteed failure. That means we have to see we have to get out of the branding, big title, and formality. We have to tackle the real deal making, even with a small subject. So that will lead to my third trap, the trap of comprehensiveness. Okay, a lot of proposals, well, had a grandiose scheme from the beginning, but in a few years that faced a huge obstacle. And when the leadership changes, that just disappear. That was the case of Northeast Asia. So instead of comprehensive, grandiose plan, we should target more substantial, tangible the issue. And finally, the trap is the trap of language. Northeast Asia, one very interesting thing historically, the leaders never say hello and how are you for a long time. When they talk, they fight. And every single word of leaders, Chinese leader, Japanese leader, Korean leader, need to be interpreted politically. So the weight of each word was too serious, too big. So, I may suggest be talkative. Don't be afraid of cheap talking. You mentioned politeness as it's important. The factor, yes, politeness is important. I would say the use of language in a much lighter form. They basically have to talk more. So, the trap of language will be quite important. So, Northeast Asia nowadays it is a very kind of in a very crucial period. We we can dive into another stage of the Cold War, or we may find, especially with the possible transition on the Korean Peninsula. So we are at a crossroad, okay? And my final comment will be the importance of timing and luck. It is not scientific, the idea, but historically, timing and luck will be quite important. That means the window of opportunity has not been open all the time. Usually, window of opportunity may open just for a short period and disappear. That's our life. That's our fate and destiny. And we should be ready to grasp that narrow window of opportunity. And for that, we have to be ready. It is too late to start thinking when the window is open, then it will be closed down. So we should be ready for multilateral cooperation possible with a few tangible, feasible scenarios. And I think that's why we are sitting in this room today. And upon this note, I will close my comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lee. It seems to me that he has a little bit of pessimistic about multilateralism or multilateralization of the Korean peace process of the Korean Pacific in the short term. But I also agree with you that bilateral as well as multilateralism should be mingled as a way to deal with the Korean Peninsula issue. Yeah. More kind of realistic. Yeah. Yeah, probably at least the North Korean nuclear issue should be dealt in a bilateral manner. But once North Korea issue is resolved between North Korea and the United States, probably we should move to multilateral approach, and then we should make effort to build a multilateral institution or mechanism, whatever we call it. And some questions posed to Ambassador Maresca, so that you may respond to his questions.
I'll try to respond to some of these questions, although I may not have noted everything. First of all, it's well to remember that during all of the years, actually, from the end of the war, and end of the Second World War in Europe to the beginning of this negotiation, NATO was the dominant organization in Europe. European Union didn't exist. Simply did not exist. There wasn't a shadow of a European Union. So NATO was the multilateral institution in Europe, and of course it was dominated by the great world power, the United States, which also had, several 100,000 troops in Europe, not to mention maybe 1,000 tanks and on and on. So the U.S. was dominant in Europe in those days, and there wasn't any other European Union or any other coordinating organization. The second thing is that you do kind of need a Finland. Finland is a great country, and I love it, and they stepped in and took on this role. Europe has this feature of several genuinely independent and non-aligned countries. Finland is one, Switzerland is another, and the Swedes are also, even the Norwegians, who are a member of NATO, are a little bit, they lean toward the Swedish line a little bit. So Europe does have this feature of having some genuinely honest brokers around. That's a feature. The other thing is that NATO, at the time that we're talking about, at the beginning of these negotiations, had been preparing for a long time for some kind of opening of negotiation with the Soviet Union. The NATO had commissioned a report by the Belgian foreign minister, who was called Harmel. So it was called the Harmel Report when it was submitted. And the Harmel Report, which was an internal report, so it was classified within the NATO circle, argued that it was time to try to find an opening toward the Soviet Union and the East in general. For selfish reasons. We needed to ease the military confrontation, all kinds of good reasons why some sort of détente should be pursued. And that was registered as NATO policy after the submission of the Harmel Report. So by trying to open a negotiation, the NATO group was simply following adopted NATO policy. And the United States, of course, was a member of the NATO, so it was our policy too. And the EU didn't exist, so that was the only thing. And then came the Finns. The Finns at that time had a strong influence coming from Moscow. You know, long common frontier, a kind of what shall I say, a dominant role of the Soviets over Finland. It did exist. Finland was technically a neutral, but if they were told severely that the Soviet Union needed something, they would, of course, do it. And in this case, they thought it was in their interests anyway, and in the interests of Europe. And the Finnish president at the closing negotiation said that it's a long tradition and long saying in Finland that security is not built by building fences. It's built by opening gates. It's an old Finnish phrase, apparently. I mean, I can't vouch for that because I'm not Finnish, but that's what the president said. And he used that to argue why Finland had assumed this responsibility of initiating this process, because they believed that security is built by opening gates. Okay, you can believe it or not, but this is the kind of thing that you can also apply in this part of the world as a rationale. You may not agree with it, but this was the approach that was taken. And so, and the Harmel Report began a long and very intense period of preparation within NATO, which was classified. That is to say, it was going on secretly within the NATO Council and its subsidiary bodies. Every single proposal that was going to be made at this security conference, whenever it occurred, was first hammered out within NATO, because we didn't agree on everything. Not with the French, for example. The Germans had their own approach. So it was often very difficult to work out what would be an allied proposal. Some of those proposals wound up, and that explains the peculiarity of the language of the final act, which is different in some places from what it is in other places. Some of those parts of the final act are NATO proposals, which were tinkered with in terms of language and then adopted on cultural exchanges, for example, perfectly harmless things. The NATO proposals were perfectly harmless things at any time except in Cold War Europe, where they were sensational, earthquake-like ideas, cultural exchanges, for example, things like that, which should be normal, but they were radical in the circumstances. So all of that was a part of the preparation process. Now, I noted some questions, but I'm having a problem reading my own handwriting. But you'll ask me. The other thing is that politically in the United States, all of this was very controversial. There's a famous headline in the Wall Street Journal: "Jerry, don't go," on the front page. Jerry, don't go. It was an appeal to Jerry Ford not to go to Helsinki to sign the final act, which we had negotiated. So we negotiators were a little worried about that. You can imagine that effect. By the way, just as a footnote, the Wall Street Journal has apologized for only 3 things that they've published in the whole existence of the Wall Street Journal, and one of them was that headline, Jerry, don't go. 20 years later, they apologized and said they were wrong. It was a good idea to go to Helsinki and sign the final act. Very unusual, yeah. So all of that was going on. None of this was really popular in the United States when it happened. People were surprised. People thought it was a giveaway, and so forth and so on. But you know, time proved differently, and I think that this was the great break in the Cold War. Nothing more, nothing less. It was the great ending of the Cold War, because it put the relationship with the Soviet Union on a different footing, with different ideals, different measures of behavior. It permitted so many different advantages and so forth and so on. But there was great suspicion about it, especially among conservatives at the time. I may have missed some of your questions, but
the role of the U.S.
Well, the role of the U.S. was two-tiered. On the one hand, we were, and this was what it was called. It was the low profile. Our strategy was the low profile, and we had a wonder. Our first head of delegation was a wonderful guy, who was very low key and didn't even seek an ambassadorial title. Imagine that, a diplomat who doesn't want to be an ambassador. And so ours was the one delegation in the whole operation that didn't have an ambassador as the head of it. So that was a part of it. And there were a lot of, things that we did that were unlike normal U.S. behavior. Low profile was the way it was labeled. We worked with the Allies. We worked with the Russians. We tried to find solutions, and many of the solutions were not found immediately. They hung out there as issues for a long time, and at the very end, I had to go around and resolve. I got Dubinin, the nasty number 2 in the Soviet delegation, and said, "Meet me by the fireplace," which was in the main hall where we were negotiating, and we met there, and we had like 10 issues that had to be resolved, and I said, this, and this, and this, and he said, okay, no, that one, this, and we worked it all out. And, these were very unusual for American diplomacy, because, first of all, because I was very young. I was nowhere near being an ambassador. I was probably, if I'd been in a normal embassy, I would have been a 3rd secretary. And de facto, I was running this negotiation. And in addition to that, even after this negotiation was finished, because it was so controversial, I didn't even get a promotion having done all of this from that low level that I was at. So, it was a very unusual operation. Still is. And by the way, I have a new book out on this, which is called Helsinki Revisited. And if you're really interested, and you can get all the straight story from my book, which has a lot of stuff in it that I think it's never been published before. Thank you.
Since you're a key negotiator for the Helsinki Final Act, I'd like to ask one related question, because the Helsinki process was successful because of the provision of human rights, which was encoded as Principle 7, and then the free movement in the basketry. So those issues were closely linked with international recognition of the territorial border caused by the World War II. So how was those issues were negotiated exactly? Can you explain about it?
Any way you could do it, basically, is the answer. You know, sometimes there was a neutral intermediary. We used the neutrals a lot: Switzerland, Finland, Sweden, Austria. So we used the neutrals as go-betweens to try to find compromises. But the original NATO proposals were pretty hard-nosed, and but some of them were traditional too. So, you know, like cultural exchanges were a long-standing feature of dealing with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union loved cultural exchanges because they were a state operation, and they could control, you know, the ballet troupe that was going to Paris. Some of them did run away, but not that many. But so cultural exchanges were a traditional thing. We expanded that. I mean, much of it is normal stuff. But there were a few things, especially under the area of human rights, that were stated, and where we were being pushed by lobbies, because in the United States, as you know, we have lobbies, a wonderful American institution who push the government to do this, to do that. And so there are all kinds of lobbies pushing for this and that. There are the Baltic state lobbyists, which are, you know, were very active, had always been, you know, the United States never recognized the Baltic states as part of the Soviet Union. So as far as we were concerned, they were independent countries, which is an irony of history. And throughout the Cold War, there were, the Baltic states had active embassies in Washington. Imagine that. To the extent that you know, the diplomats in one embassy died over the years, and so the only one left was the chauffeur, and he became the ambassador. So I mean, there were a lot of ironies. People don't know all the details of this sort of thing that are embedded in the history. But we could not, for example, acknowledge that the Baltic states were part of the Soviet Union. We never did. And there were, you know, every country has in its history some elements like that continue and have to be respected. You too. Did you have another question for me?
All right, okay. We are now running out of time, so that I'd like to pay attention to the issue we are discussing, that is how to revitalize Jeju peace process. Helsinki process started with the Tea Party at the ambassadorial level. So I'd like to ask all panelists to give some suggestions or ideas how to revitalize Jeju peace process. Maybe from Professor Lee, do you have any idea?
That is a challenging the question. If I have a real good answer, then I will run for the governor for the next term. But I was, yeah, actually the Jeju, well, the island of Jeju has it's kind of very strong symbolic value as a peace island, and this Jeju Forum has been nowadays recognized as one of the major kind of the peace building dialogue in this part of the world. So I think the keeping that kind of the ideation or that the knowledge-based effort should be continued, but the discourse is discourse, rhetoric is rhetoric, and we can bring a number of big figures, famous the world leaders to talk about the peace. Well, that is certainly is a great contribution. But I would like to see maybe just one or two very kind of small but very concrete agenda for cooperation. Well, it can be microdose. This is being covered in the presidential office, prime minister's office now. But so this already became too big issue. But well, it can be the tourism. It can be some other kind of environmental agenda, or the marine ecosystem, whatever. Well, I want to see well, alongside with this great kind of achievement of Jeju, the Jeju Forum, some concrete agenda need to be pursued, not with a 2 or 3 year perspective, but from the beginning, 5 to 10 year perspective. So if we see the progress of those agenda, and maybe at some point that will reach to a certain level. And what is important is, well, I mentioned the trap of comprehensiveness, but what is important is building one successful template. Okay, institutional spillover would not be made automatically, but if we have one successful template, then we can bring another issue, agenda to that template. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not work, but having a template and not having a template is totally different. So that would be my suggestion.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Kim, do you have any idea?
Not much, not that much, but I try to say something, yeah. As I mentioned earlier, to reflect Professor Lee Jae-sung's idea in terms of window of opportunity arrives from time to time, but they never expect a lot of time. They are not prolonged long time. No, that's quite an interesting idea. Therefore, I think after all, process is process. No? It's not really concrete regime among government people. Try to something to await for that window of opportunity. In that regard, also this morning, the governor of Jeju declared that next forum he want to invite people from Pyongyang, no? In this forum. I think that is quite significant step forward. And why not also Chinese, etc., etc. Therefore, also in my short paper for today, I mentioned that there could be fully formal possibility, which means 1.1, 1.5, and 2.0. Any track would be possible. And then in the meantime, 0.5 is much more realizable, no? Together with from the public sector, together with private or academia. No? So Jeju Forum could be utilized in that regard, accommodate and invite more stakeholders in the region, and to start to discussion and negotiate, not negotiation, discussion, no? What will be. And in that regard, again, I want to emphasize that under current administration, we have this quite good scheme, which is NAPCR, Northeast Asia, plus Community of Responsibility. And under this umbrella, we have two pillars. One is pillar of peace, the other is pillar of prosperity. In terms of prosperity, we have already, I mentioned that is new southern and new northern policy. No? That is much more economic oriented. While pillar of peace is really platform, make a platform. No? Therefore, I know that even my EU center last year, we had an international conference utilizing this concept, but many scholars expressed that still the NAPCR is not so clear, no? to adapt and to materialize. But in my view, from much more idealistic or constructivistic point of view, no, this should be utilized. That is, pillar of peace, a kind of platform to discussing this matter in the Korean Peninsula, in East Asia region. And in that regard, the direct stakeholders are those so-called six-party members. No? Now, Mongolia is included. Then international partners are such as OSCE, European Union, UN, etc., together with Australia and New Zealand. That is the concept of NAPCR, and under that, the pillar of peace platform making. Therefore, Jeju Forum, I think not just could, but should utilize that concept into materialization, and therefore making platform really workable, inviting from Pyongyang and from Beijing and Tokyo, and discuss more in detail. Yeah, better to from small but significant step forward, you know, such as what about energy issue or climate issue, much more workable issue could be dealt with. I think that is the real step to be taken initially, and then to see this window opportunity arrive sometime. Okay, that's my idea. Thank you.
And then Lyndon, please.
Well, there's a lot to consider and a lot to think about. As I've been around the conference and listened to other speakers, I too heard the governor's statement, and I think that, as you talk about these windows open and close, and it's not so much luck as it is preparation, being ready for them to open. And this idea he's mentioned of the food aid, right? He talked about sending food as well as inviting people. One of the things that concerned me was in another panel, a panelist argued that North Korea is again facing famine, and that when they faced famine, they would come to the negotiating table. And I think that's a serious mistake. I'm not certain that they would actually come to the negotiating table if they faced famine. And I think that using food aid as a concession that way is extremely harmful. Now, in terms of what to do to prepare for more bilateral or the possibility of more multilateral negotiations, the idea is to create some sort of confidence building, build a little bit of trust. So if you go back to the confidence building literature, the types of gestures that you make that are seen as meaningful and legitimate and sincere are those that cost the sender something. That's where I think that food aid ought to be disconnected from the negotiating process, and it ought to just be offered. And I think that's something that could be done multilaterally. It satisfies certain things. You talk about a small thing that can be done that can mean a lot. But on the other hand, one of the great fears of the North Korean regime is that the other parties want regime change. They want to oust the regime. And, food aid has been mentioned as a potential lever to do that. So if you take that lever away and you say, we're going to give up that lever, we're going to provide food aid unconditionally, and then, it doesn't change the balance of power very much, but it does send an opening. Because if you want another party to come to the table and negotiate, on the one hand, you can reduce the negative things you do to them. You can also make it look like there's a catastrophe coming, or the catastrophe we may have just escaped one. But on the other hand, you have to produce also an enticing opportunity. What do the other party get out of this? They want stability, they want an increased economy, they want protection for their regime. We want the regime to change in some ways, but we may have to agree that it's not going to disappear. It hasn't collapsed now. It's not going to collapse in the way that people have argued that it is. So that's perhaps the one concrete step that I would suggest that a multilateral group, whether it be the states or whether it be the organizations or even Jeju, would say, we're going to take that humanitarian gesture, we're going to provide food aid unconditionally and enough so that you won't have threats of starvation until you can come to us and negotiate something a little more permanent, long-lasting, addressing the nuclear issue, and then maybe addressing the issue of North Korea's relationship with all of its neighbors.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I agree with all of the suggestions that have been made. Here's my list. I suggest inviting many countries because I think it's good to have as many issues that are not the central issues as you can, and every country has its own issues. So you want a kind of a ragtag list of all kinds of issues that have to be discussed that camouflages the central issues and makes it easier to have a generally acceptable agenda. Secondly, I would invite as many countries as possible because there again, you want the confusion and so forth of many countries with different interests. You don't want to have the whole thing focused on North Korea, or they won't come. But in that kind of a situation where they can think that they will be able to make their own case about their country, maybe they would come. And then I think you need to have some general ideas. I think yours are good, of what would comprise an agenda, and which would not be the central issues like sovereignty and war and peace and stuff like that. You want sort of innocuous subjects that can be discussed. You'll get to the main subjects anyway, believe me. And then just you have to be prepared to stay for a long time. You have to have a lot of patience. This kind of an operation is very slow. But on the other hand, it's worthwhile, right? So you have to have the patience to go through it. And there'll be obstacles and probably periods when somebody walks out. And so you have to have the patience to deal with all of those things.
Okay, before we close this session, I'd like to give a chance to ask a question from the floor. Do you have any? Yes, please. Mike? Do you have a mic? Yes? No, wait a minute. They bring mic.
Thank you. I'm Nam Sik-in, working at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. I'm reading about the Middle East. This is quite far from the issue today, but my question is going to Mr. Ambassador. So when it comes to dealing with the so-called implementation of Helsinki process, one of the most important issues was, my understanding is that the human rights issues. But as we all witnessed, it's quite sensitive issue to deal with North Korea at the moment. So what would you advise to Korean government to deal with these human rights issues to the North Korea? Thank you.
I think I would start by saying you have to have two phases. First, what you're going to negotiate and what you're going to be able to get in a negotiation with, for example, North Korea. Is probably not going to be much on human rights, but they'll probably agree to something. And then afterwards, what you would do about implementation. So there are two entirely different issues. And in every country, human rights, once it gets on the table, becomes very sensitive, very public, very political, very active, because you have all kinds of NGOs out there and, groups, minority groups, whatever kind of groups you have. They'll all immediately become super active. So you have to be aware that that's going to happen in advance. And you have to also be prepared for what you will be able to get, which will probably not be what you would like. You may have to have some very, innocuous language that can be interpreted in various ways in order to get it through and get it approved. So it would be ambiguous. It won't be what human rights groups will want. And you also have to be prepared to deal with what will happen afterwards, because right away the human rights groups become super active and pushy and obnoxious and everything else, because they will seize on whatever is negotiated, even if it's totally innocuous, and make it into a banner. So that's just the reality in this area. And the best thing is to go to existing documents. There are versions of human rights that are agreed by everybody. I mean, North Korea belongs to the UN, right? So they have accepted all the UN documentation on human rights, in theory anyway, and document-wise. So that's a tool and something that you can keep up front, that they've already accepted all of these things, so why wouldn't they accept it? So they're all that. But this, I think, you should get your diplomats who are focused on human rights. They know all of these arguments by heart, and figure out what's tolerable, what might work, and things like that. And that's where your starting point is.
Okay, Dr. Han.
Thank you. This is more personal kind of reflection than a comment, strictly speaking. I joined Jeju Peace Institute, which organized this conference. So I've been working for this institute for more than 10 years. And since I joined this institute, I formed the belief that multilateralism is something we need and something desirable. So I've been trying to, we actually, because research fellows at our institute, we collectively try to promote multilateralism in Northeast Asia and beyond. That's what we have been doing so far. But since last year, I'm beginning to have a second thought. We try to vitalize multilateralism in Northeast Asia, especially in relation to North Korean nuclear crisis. So we spent 10 years, even more than that, trying to start or resume six-party talks. And Park Geun-hye government, to some extent, Moon Jae-in government, are trying to revitalize multilateralism for the region. What I think now, two things. By trying to start six-party talks, we just gave North Koreans time to develop nuclear weapons. So multilateralism or multilateral approach was not just ineffective, it was counterproductive. So in a way, if we know what we know now, if we knew back then what we know now, we should have given up multilateral approach altogether and try to do something that is more bilateral or minilateral. But we didn't do that. We just tried to vitalize multilateralism for the region, just thinking that it worked in Western Europe. But it didn't work here. In fact, it worked counterproductively. So I'm having a second thought. And another thing related to this is that we may be finally seeing the beginning of resolution of North Korean nuclear crisis. And that beginning was made possible because of direct dialogues between North Korea and South Korea, and also North Korea and the United States. So what's working here in Northeast Asia is maybe bilateralism, not multilateralism. We somehow thought that we should promote multilateralism, but that was good intention. And I totally believed in that cause. But now I'm thinking that maybe our assumption may be incorrect. So now I think that I'm reluctant to support the idea to revitalize Jeju peace process in the current format, in the multilateral format. We should try to do something else. And one thing we do, Jeju Peace Forum is what this forum used to be called until 2012. And Professor In Nam-sik, who is here, was directly involved in organizing Jeju Forum 2007, where Jeju process was proposed by the participant at the conference. So since then, Jeju Forum has been a multilateral dialogue promoting multilateral peace process. But we may need more. We may need another platform, or we may need additional process. So what we are trying to do in terms of conference organizing is that we try to have regional conferences where we have bilateral dialogue or trilateral dialogue and dealing with more specific issues, not necessarily military or security issues. So I think because of the rather unsuccessful history of multilateralism in Northeast Asia, and the recent changes in North Korea, and also its relations with South Korea, and also America. I think Jeju Forum is also evolving, and reflecting on past achievement and also failures. Thank you very much.
Okay, do you expect any response from the panelists or? Right. Okay. Yes. Last comment is
Just on our subject, which is these CSE negotiations that took place. We tried to do a bilateral negotiation on this with the Soviet Union. They rejected it. That was the reason we went to a multilateral format, because they had rejected. I mentioned this at the beginning. Manley Obrozio, who had just retired as the Secretary General, was designated as what they called the explorer, but it was the initial negotiator with the Soviet Union. We were going to send him, one person, but the Soviets rejected it. They issued a communique that they were not prepared to negotiate with the representative of a military alliance, because he had just been the NATO Secretary General. So, and then we fell back to a format which they had proposed, because it was the Soviets who told the Finns to invite everybody. And that was where the format came from. It wasn't our choice. So in a way, I agree with you. It's much neater if you can negotiate bilaterally. But I think from the Soviet point of view, it was more advantageous to negotiate multilaterally. They knew they could line up all their allies, tell them what to do, so they would have a bloc, an effective bloc in this group. Whereas we, on the West, were much more disjointed. We wouldn't be able to have the same control. So they thought they would have an advantage. What they didn't understand is that the principles that we were talking about, freer movement of people, human rights, all of that stuff, we all shared in the West. It wasn't a matter of government instructions. It was a matter of values. So we were all allies because of that. We all argued the same position because of that, because we agreed on these things, not because we had a position paper. And they didn't understand that. They didn't know that they were getting into something like that. It just, the mentality didn't understand that. They didn't know it.
okay. Many issues were addressed during our discussions, but time is not enough to cover everything. There are many different views on the future of the peace process on the Korean Peninsula, the multilateral cooperation in Northeast Asia, pessimistic or optimistic. But future is not predictable. Anything can happen. So I think that in the future, if North Korean leader Kim Jong-un visit South Korea, probably he may wish to visit the Halla Mountain in Jeju Island. Then if we have the summit meeting, inter-Korean summit meeting, or summit meeting between North Korea and the United States in the Jeju Island will be the symbol of peace. Then Jeju peace process will start at that point. So I'd like to thank you for your active participation. Particularly, I'd like to extend my gratitude to Ambassador Maresca, because he traveled from Europe to attend this conference. He has another session after the dinner. So we are looking forward to your another talk over there. Thank you very much.